Okay, we're recording.
Yay. All right. So welcome to the first meeting of this reading group. Hello, everybody. I think we've all sort of met. Have we? Does everybody know each other? I don't really know MASH. So maybe not everybody knows each other. So we could go around the room, maybe. I'm Matt. I'm a historian of science. I work at the University of Toronto, and I work with EDGI in the archiving working group. And I'm psyched to learn some stuff. I guess I'm sort of convening, moderating today. And next on my screen, I see J.C. Cahill, whose actual name I didn't quite hear.
I'm Jeremy Cahill. I head the meme studies research project, which you haven't heard of yet because it is a nascent thing. That its white paper is going to be submitted this month, and Masha does too. She can introduce herself still, but we both work on that.
And then I see Rob. That's awesome. Thanks, Jeremy.
I'm Rob Brackett. I do some volunteer work for EDGI, Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, with Matt and Don and Brendan a little bit on monitoring changes to government web pages. And I'm also doing a little bit of work right now for Protocol Labs on IPFS related documentation.
Don?
Hi, I'm Dawn. I'm also based in Toronto at the University of Toronto. I'm a PhD student. And I feel like I wind up getting involved in a lot of projects that brush up on or directly try to address questions of decentralization, both through EDGI, its role in Data Together, and then also I'm a part of a group called Toronto Mesh here in Toronto, and I'm organizing the second year of an event about building our own network infrastructures called State of Our Networks. I love the name, so I just say it a lot. Yeah, so I'm really excited to read some of the stuff or like revisit a lot of it while thinking about it in this context with others.
Brendan is who I see next.
My name is Brendan O'Brien. I go by B5 on the internet. I'm a member of EDGI, and I also work at a company called Query that chooses to spell its name QRI. We work on decentralized data sets built on top of IPFS, which came directly out of data rescue work and loving working with grassroots people doing decentralized archiving and data commenting, which leads me to Data Together and this wonderful space. Pumped to do some reading. And having done some reading, actually did the homework on it, so I'm pumped.
And then Matt, and then Mash.
I'm Matt Zumwalt. I'm program manager for the IPFS project and the P2P protocol and the sort of ecosystem around those. And was one of the people who helped start the Data Together collaboration. And I'm super excited to get to do this reading list because I don't know, in doing all this work, sometimes you don't get to pause and update your thinking about these core ideas and reflect on have things changed, has my understanding of those things changed. So I'm very much happy to see this happening.
Excellent. And Mash?
Hi, I'm Masha. I just finished my undergrad. It's definitely not in anything that's quite directly related to this. I studied graphic design, but I'm really interested in learning more and like understanding all this stuff.
Fantastic. So here we are. It's interesting to think for me to see these readings together. They kind of represent these different moments of enthusiasm for decentralization, you know, from really the earliest canonical expression of, you know, the idea of a decentralized internet through 2015, which feels like a very different moment than today. You know, it's only 3 years ago, but it feels really different. And into this sort of, I'd say, we see the first two are both sort of positive statements of the virtues of decentralization or distribution. And there the terms are, not quite distinguished from each other. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit. And the third is more of a problem statement, right? That about the coming apocalypse. And and there's a companion piece which I only read very quickly, in which the sort of solution space is described, but we didn't read that, or we didn't all read that necessarily. So, there are some couple things that jumped out for me, but I wonder if we could kind of just raise hands and kind of collect a set of themes and questions that we want to talk about, and then kind of I'll try to help organize that a little bit as the discussion moves forward.
And if you don't have video on, feel free to post in chat.
Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I like how you characterized it about these sort of moments of enthusiasm, and I'm really interested in that, and kind of and would be interested in others' thoughts about these waves, about what were the motivating factors around people promoting decentralization at different times. Because I think looking at Barron in contrast to the more recent stuff, there's something there that I kind of want to hover around. And another question I have is kind of this disentangling or way that people treat web and internet. And I want to talk about that a little bit with folks. Yeah, those are my two big ones. But also, oh, sorry, do you want me to say it again?
I kind of lost that second one, but.
Just kind of how they're treating the web and the internet in their, in each respective piece, but that's probably more relevant on the more recent two, so Brewster Kails and Andrew Stoltz. And then I would love if we could spend a little bit of time talking about distributed and decentralized and centralized, which maybe we could draw from Barron on, because I think that's something that has come up a lot, where how we want to think about decentralized as opposed to distributed.
Go ahead, Brendan.
For me, the Brewster's raising of the code is law from Larry Lessig, to me was a real jump off point of how a lot of this conversation, particularly around decentralization, seems to graft social values and technical principles, and how those two are, how decentralization these three sort of papers all have something to say. The first one has very little to say socially, but it's sort of using this notion of a network attack as this existential threat that should be planned against, and sort of uses that mechanism to sort of side skirt the whole conversation about social values. But then the other two sort of really put that socialized value system and as an impetus for decentralization. So I'd really like to just take some time to try and understand how that works and the intention behind that, and what other people see about that graphing of social values onto technical principles. For me, that's everything I care about. So.
Anybody else have something they want to make sure we talk about? Go ahead, Matt.
It's more like a reading between the lines with basically, so, okay, I can give an example rather than a term for it. So a lot of people think of Bitcoin or Ethereum as being distributed because anyone can run a peer, but they're definitely not offline first, right? So if I became disconnected from the Ethereum network and I wanted to continue operating, I couldn't. My operations wouldn't be valid, or as soon as I reconnected with the rest of the network, they would cease to be valid. So there's this nuance there where it's like almost as confusing and intractable as like the notion of intersectionality, or the things that arrive when people start talking about intersectionality, that there's like these different layerings of, well, it could be distributed in this sense, but then not distributed in this other sense. And if you fail that, then it impacts certain portions of the network and creates different kinds of incentives. So there's this nuance there that I find myself wanting to unpack of, is there a lack of nuance in the terminology we're using? And can we get more refined there?
Jeremy or Rob or Masha, you guys have anything you want to say?
I mentioned in the chat, so kind of a hand wavy question, but the question of an actual attempt at a social network using SSB and seeing the consequences of it and things that people want to be able to take back from it once the network has grown in scale, including maybe not wanting it to be quite as open, or maybe not wanting to have to replicate all of the content of all the people that might fall bidirectionally, as well as issues of you are not the user issues about digital literacy and designing for people who are not the 1% of technical proficiency, in terms of not knowing how they persist their data if they want to change the computer that they're on. Those sorts of issues that I think are often wildly understated because they're seen as insulting to the population, when really I find that to be the paternalistic view itself. But those things that matter to people who need to everyday users who need to use the tools that people gloss right over in the tech sphere.
Cool. Masha, you got anything? Or should we move ahead?
Just keep going. I'll maybe some stuff along the way.
Okay, great. I mean, so I think nobody else here is a historian, so you may not want to move in chronological order, which is always what I want to do. But in Brewster's piece, you see him talking about the kind of utopian vision of the web from the early 1990s, which itself kind of in some ways builds on the, in some strange way, is in any case dependent on this vision of a kind of indestructible network that Paul Baran puts forward in the 1960s. So there's this line that really is continuous, thinking about building the technological systems that guarantee something, like back to kind of Brendan's point, that guarantee some kind of social order that you want to preserve, and I wonder if we can take a moment to reflect on those different versions of the vision, and maybe it's having Baran there, and who's motivated by thermonuclear war and first strike capacity. It may be a moment to ask ourselves to interrogate some of those values. I think those of us who work in this world kind of accept a certain default set of values, about what's good. And I feel like for myself, I haven't really thought about this deeply, but, for decades, I thought the web's not perfect, but it makes the world a better place. And then in the wake of the Trump election, I started to wonder, whether that was true. And so first of all, whether the connection between values and the technical system are really are truly there. And second, whether I actually share values with the the kind of main figures who put them forward. Lessig, Tim Berners-Lee, people like Brewster. So I don't know. I'd like to hear from other people.
I think I can answer this in a temporal sense, which I think is maybe helpful. I think that one of the phenomena you keep saying is we come up with these technologies as they're and promote these technologies, and then maybe not fail to, but there's the consequence of them existing and whole populace and sets of people iterating on those technologies and doing things with them that are all these second order consequences that weren't in any way intended in the first place, and also like create a degree of literacy that a culture is sort of coming forward with, right? Like I think you're hearing a lot of discourse right now, particularly around like our use of social media and how like social media and the effects of our use of social media. And I think something that we kind of sometimes lose a little track of is like we as a populace are maturing with these technologies, right? Like we have never existed in a space where we are this Twitter connected or this Facebook connected, and that is going to change us, but there's nothing that stops us as a set of people from deciding to use these tools that exist differently and making active choices around that differently. But I think what we do have is when we're having these kinds of conversations, we're kind of talking about like the framing tools. These are sort of like constitutional conversations in the sense that we're trying to decide like what are the sort of inbounds and out of bounds sort of promoted behaviors of a set of technologies or a suite of technologies, and what are we going to sort of encourage you to do or discourage you from doing by virtue of what is easy and what isn't easy, and what is well documented and what isn't well documented. And so I think that's part of it, right? Where you're saying like, I don't know whether I agree or disagree with this. I think I agree with the original intention of some of these things. I disagree with some of the outcomes of these things, and I think that both can be true at the same time. I don't know if that's fair.
Don and then Rob. Rob and then Don.
Okay. I'm mostly going to point to Don anyway. So I think what ties in with that maybe a little that I find really interesting comes back to that question about framing devices and values, in that like, so as you put it, sort of the framing device for that early paper is very much around like robustness and attack and defense. And then the framing device for Brewster Kahle's talk is very much, he ends with it. He says, this is about First Amendment values and about everybody being able to speak. Whereas I think the web started dying in 2014 piece ties a little bit, maybe not exactly, but a little bit to what I think of when I think about like people working on like community mesh networks. And I think Dawn can speak much better to this, which is it's not so much about speech, but it's about like equitability and access, which is a different thing, right? Even though it's equitability tends to intersect a little bit there, but it's a different thing. And this idea of like all these people, like the other interesting thing here is this idea that a big difference between what we're talking about with all these different distributed technologies and say the underlying internet technologies is the baking in of a set of values into a design of like how we communicate and use all this stuff and everything.
I don't I don't have more insightful things to say about like community networking or mesh stuff, except I agree it is just, there's like a distinct, and what I would say like there's an autonomy around like sort of making our own definitions of like what is inclusion and what is equity. in some sense, maybe in response to a failure for like the more legalistic ones to actually account for things that they say they are. And maybe like the sort of, I read like Brewster Kahle as being like this very like working within like established like legal like state frameworks, in like what it's echoing to. I actually just wanted to go a little bit back to like the first provocation or question that you said, Matt P, about, and as a response say, like, I thought the web was not great a lot sooner. Like, I don't think I ever had an easy time on the web, or I remember my first, like, even being in IRC, like pretending I wasn't a woman and stuff like that. So I also feel like there's a way that, you know, I have a very privileged web experience, but like seeing the cracks of that and like almost not being able to ignore the way it is any longer. And then as someone who like just like so into cyberpunk when I was a kid, like I love William Gibson. I like totally, part of me would like read like John Perry Barlow's like manifesto and be like, yeah. But at the same time, like I feel like this tension within myself, and like that's not like, it doesn't feel like satisfying enough. And I don't know. So that's not anything really meaningful to say, except that I'm really wondering, like, if I think the way Staltz is talking about, and what I think is this contemporary moment of framing why decentralization feels right. I don't know. Like, to me, I'm like, is that the right story we need to be telling ourselves to work on this? And that's kind of what I hope to figure out.
Jeremy has his hand up. I now know how to read that, and then Matt.
Thank you. Yes, I also now know how to do it. It's hidden in that tab. So I guess two related things. One is that many people, I think, who are less experienced with technical matters and are having social thought appear for first time in relation to technology, especially social technology. Many of the necessary consequences of the types of belief systems that they hold are probably a kind of top-down cultural terraforming in the same way that they probably despise when it's not their value set that is being upheld. They just probably don't yet realize it because they don't know enough technically to understand that to uphold one thing probably will preclude another. So that's a problem when people talk about stuff that relates to the ethics of different networks, and they talk about things like Mastodon versus Twitter, et cetera. They're often talking about their model being correct, and this in practice has never been how patchworks have worked. If you look at chat networks, for instance, they've all operated differently. The networks have operated differently. Some have insisted that you don't register at all. Some have, they have different value systems, and to a certain extent, they are fundamentally incompatible. And you gain certain things and you lose certain things, but you can't force them to be compatible when they cannot be, given under the constraints of the people who are running the network. The other point is that you run the risk of, I think, being dangerously irrelevant in the in the value debates department by failing to consider that much of the decentralized web stuff, all the shiny glitzy stuff that runs now, that tech people want to play with, like all the DAT and the shiny DAT stuff and the shiny IPFS stuff, and these are not things that people who primarily access the web from a phone will ever touch. They will never touch them. And if you go back to the Staltz piece, the recurring trend with the problem of centralization in the big three is that they are so, for instance, 90% of Facebook's ad revenue comes from its mobile app, its native app. That hugely limits what sorts of considerations can be made when talking about what you can do to limit the influence of this massive centralizing social media presence when your activity may not really affect their bottom line because that's not where they make their money anyway. So there's that.
Matt, go ahead.
Well, yeah, this partially comes from reading the Stoltz article of, like, he teases out that Google kind of doubled down and said, what we're going to take, Google has clearly doubled down, and their approach to getting revenue is selling ads and using artificial intelligence to do it. And as long as they get to do that, they're happy with whatever happens. And Facebook is their whole angle is selling ads by like building and influencing social networks. And like his point, sort of what he teases out is that the locus of power there for both of them, and then Amazon by extension does a similar thing. The locus of power is in the ability to influence people's behavior while peeking into their behavior in order to anticipate so that you can then influence their behavior even better. And there's nothing about decentralization that undermines that, especially with the Google approach, right? That it's all about just being really good at analyzing the information that's out there and then providing really good analysis in order to influence people's behavior, right? It's this like self-fulfilling loop. You could, sorry, my phone is, you could decentralize everything and they would still be able to do that. So like there would still be that power, that like strength of hold over the behavior of everyone in the network and the flow of like actual communication in the network. And it makes me think of like in China, as long as you don't talk about politics, you can say whatever you want, right? Like there's a great amount of freedom as long as you don't do the thing that undermines the power of the people who are powerful. And it feels like the web is shifted into a similar thing, and that a decentralized version of the web could suffer from that same situation. That there are still these extremely influential parties that are like, yeah, great, decentralized. Yeah, use your peer-to-peer stuff. Sure, mesh networks, great. Like, as long as you don't undermine our ability to influence the behavior of the majority of the people in this network as we see fit. And so it's kind of like, I don't know, that leaves me in this place that's kind of like, whoa, what's the point? Is there really, what is the benefit of it? And I'm not fully pessimistic in there. It's like, let's get clear on what is the benefit there.
Jeremy, do you want to ask that question you just asked in Slack? No, oh no, sorry, it's Don.
Patch. When you use the word patch, trying. So patch. I said, did I say patch directly, or did I say patchwork?
I thought you. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to derail. I was just really curious.
I'm sorry. I thought it was from Jeremy responding to something from Matt that I missed when my audio dropped out.
No, yeah. It was just, I thought you said patch is like a discrete concept. So I was wondering if you were like thinking about it that way and if it offered something.
No, but I did think that Matt was raising something that I was trying to articulate roughly along the same lines, which is that, Google.org and Facebook.org and these groups, they can do things like donate millions of dollars to effectively do the version of the CIA funding French postmodern writers in the 60s. They can effectively, they're big enough now that they can just fund opposition that doesn't really cut to the crux of what their business model is. And they are happy to do it, and it's this plastering over all the things that might be fundamentally terrible about them, and that might actually be actively preventing society from moving forward. they can throw money at it, and they can say, well, now that you have your $1 million for your pet project, where you're convinced that you are secretly subverting us, you're very clever. You'll take our money and you'll totally usurp us. We know you think that, but we're writing it off because we have more lawyers than you. So it's not even going to come out of their taxes. In my sphere, I know someone who recently just got $1 million from Google.org for a platform co-op project, and the entire premise of the project is something that ostensibly, if Google was worried about it, they would never pay for the project. So there's a lot of this to exist, you must interface with these giants, but to interface with the giants is to play by their terms to a certain extent.
Go ahead, Rob, and then Brendan.
So I think maybe to fold into that a little bit, and a lot of what Matt was saying, or to maybe echo Matt a little bit, I feel like there's this sense in which, for me, like being somebody who lives and works in Silicon Valley, Startupsville, the thing I feel like I see a lot is not so much that any given set of low-level technologies competes with what any of these internet companies are doing, so much as they tend to operate from a standpoint of, okay, this is the way the world works today. Like, what can we build on top of that? And so I don't think people would, and I don't think companies like Google or Facebook, or even the next Google or Facebook that's a startup today, will like meaningfully see a difference in the sense we're talking about, between operating on like a decentralized web and a web like we have today. And I think that also, to like Matt's point about like about these companies getting big enough to sort of like see everything, and you also, Jeremy, obviously feeds back to this earlier discussion before we like really got started about submarine cables and sort of ownership of all the actual infrastructure, that the more of that is owned, the less it matters whether it's centralized or decentralized, because it's still, from that party's perspective, centralized on them. And that is always going to be the case the larger scale you get. And I wonder also how much of that is about sort of the world's corporate environment we live in today, which is maybe a little bit echoing of like 1920s, although maybe it's cliche to like talk about that right now. I don't know. But this sense that rather than at increasing scales, things becoming more patchwork because they're just too big for any one organization to own them, I think we're in an environment today where it's the opposite is true. At tiny scales, it's very hard for those large entities to have any ownership. And that's one of the interesting reasons why mesh networks are both valuable and interesting to people in terms of access and ownership of infrastructure, because those large corporations actually can't reach down to that level and operate effectively, but also both from a like, can I get away from them perspective, but also like, I need this access and they're not providing it perspective. But anyway, so we're in this environment where as you grow to that increasing scale, like now it becomes more singly owned rather than more patchwork today, which is an interesting thing to think about, I guess. And then to reach back to Matt's point about like, what's the point, is also interesting to consider, I think, the ways in which an organization like Google, especially like Google actually, owns infrastructure at the large scale, and they own software at the small scale. And that's how they hit both of those and see everything at both of those scales, right? So even if you're communicating over a small decentralized network, you're communicating through their software. This gets back to Jeremy's point about that user on a phone never sees, like IPFS or whatever, even if they were operating over a network like that, because probably they're using like the file sharing capability that's built into your Android phone. And if decentralized stuff picks up in the same sense of these companies will just use the build on top of whatever, like file sharing between Android devices will like use the innate capabilities of that distributed network. So there's definitely something more to think about there, and how these low-level technologies probably potentially don't address those issues at all. I don't know. That gets back to Matt's like, what's the point? And I don't know what to say to that other than, yeah, maybe what's the point, I guess.
That.
Yeah, I'm going to try to tie some of this stuff together in a rolling ramble. We'll see how this goes. Yeah, I think what's the point, I think, for me, if we move from the sort of like question of which freedoms we want to be baking in here, if we sort of stick with this like grafting of social and technical concepts, like, okay, freedom of expression, parking that for a second, I think this question of like freedom of association is really where like peer-to-peer starts to show up in an interesting form, which is one of the sort of like overarching themes in the current sort of infrastructure or the current sort of design of the web is predicated on being able to form some form of panopticism, right? Being able to watch the activity of a lot of people and collect information, passive information about that behavior. So if you think about like merely in visiting a website, I have given a silly amount of stuff to a silly number of corporations, right? And a lot of the things we've been describing are all layers of insurance against us being able to circumnavigate that silly number, that thing that is now very understood in a highly refined capitalist setting to be valuable, right? Like, so now the internet, my internet service provider collects the information on what internet stuff I want. My browser collects information on what internet stuff I want. The website collects what internet stuff I want. The social networks I'm logged into connect, and they're all really interested in what website I just went to or what I just Googled, and like whether I just Googled for like how my face feels today or whatever, like, and that all of a sudden becomes some pointer that you can assemble back into some precise sort of targeted revenue model. And if we sort of unwind that a bunch from like that we didn't end up there like because everybody wanted to build some giant like surveillance system. We ended up there because the internet didn't really have a solid revenue model. And so if we need some mechanism for people to make money, it's like we have this like wonderful sort of new technology use, and advertisement just became this obvious way to monetize content, right? And it just works. And so I think if you like pull that back and we say, okay, thinking about freedom of association again, like that's the thing that to me is really like, what is the point? The point is, I think the modern person using their phone, when they send a WhatsApp message from one phone to another phone, the subtle belief is it went from A to B, right? But it didn't go from A to B. It went A, server, 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 B. And that sort of double take really, you feel like you have freedom of association. You've been sold the notion of freedom of association, but like the fact that you can't do that, and then like we even sort of complicate this conversation further and say, oh, it's encrypted. You can use Signal, and then that means that everyone can only measure the entropy of the fact that it went through A, server, 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 B. It was 7 megahertz. And so like, I think this like question of like, the freedom of association on the internet is kind of seems like something that is worth trying to address if you are sort of spelunking around in the depths of the HCP stack and resurfacing to people. And Jeremy, I couldn't agree more with the notion that like we need to be trying to surface this to end users, but it's also our job to take this rhetoric and cut it down and make it more palatable. And so I think like for me, the point is there are these consequential effects that come when we design technologies and then leave out this question of like a revenue model, or leave out this question of like, how do people interact with these systems and what freedoms are they getting or not getting through their use of them. And so to me, the point is to ensure that if you want to do this in such a way that it is possible. Today, if you wanted to do it, it will be extremely hard because a lot of that technology requires you to dig into the command line and blah, blah, blah. But if tomorrow it's a little less hard, we now have a trend line we can measure, and then we could start to kind of work toward a future that we want to sort of see a little bit. But you measure the trend line, not the existence of the current, because like there is nothing on the face of the planet that beats Google and Amazon and Facebook and FANG today. Like there just isn't, and so you can only work in terms of trajectories, I think.
Jeremy, and then I think Matt Zed has the next hand.
So I did want to mention that concretely, there are some things that I think are pretty obvious consequences in terms of pop cultural behavior that indicates some things that people who are archivists can easily start setting themselves to task to do, much like the climate archive stuff all coming to a head because of the context in the U.S. political context. Stuff like the extreme pop loathing of Facebook, but not mass exodus from Facebook, is something. There is what we've observed is there is this hugely booming creation of these endless small fiefdoms and archipelagos of primarily chat-oriented hubs of activity for people across all kinds of contexts, across scientific discussion, meme discussion, all kinds of stuff where people are trying essentially to hidey-hole themselves away from the panopticon, at least in terms of how comfortable they feel and how intimate the setting feels, by picking a place like Discord where they only ever have to talk to like 150 people and just burrowing there and creating all these hierarchies among themselves and doing these elaborate things in ways that are Nazi discussion in ways that are challenging for archival, and that also that require it to a large extent self-archival if they were to be archived at all. And so if you want to talk about value that can be provided to users of services in terms of the ability to have their stuff over longer periods of time without the need to rely on Facebook, etc., then small things like, are they on Slack? Do they have a 10,000 message limit? And Slack just says fuck off after that. Those are fairly critical things. They're small things to people in the grand view, but the grand view doesn't mean anything to people who are there to post memes or there to link scientific papers, and they don't even know that they have a 10K message limit. These sorts of things, if you are really insistent on trying to maximize the optionality that people have with data portability and with their ability to feel relatively assured in taking their stuff and transplanting it somewhere else or being able to view it later, even if the pit boss of the chat kicked them out, that I think it's difficult, and it's not sexy in terms of GitHub stars. And it looks like projects like matrix.org, and it's awful, and no one wants to ever have to deal with implementing it. But that's a huge thing, I think, going forward. It's all those things.
Yeah, I have Matt Zed on, and I'm just want to, I have some stuff from the chat. I really want to make sure we come back to this question of the corporate environment and this relationship between technology, democracy, or maybe we should say values or not, and capital. And if I hope that we can continue to keep surfacing the what's the point, which I think Brendan was getting at a little bit there too. So I just want to make sure that's all foregrounded. Matt.
Yeah, my comments are right aligned with what you just said of recentering on those things. There's, first of all, like in terms of the corporate environment, I just wanted to, we're using like fatalist terminology about like, oh, Google and Facebook have locked in and we're stuck with them forever. And it's like, remember the last, like the decentralization move of the personal computer environment was all about the giant evils of IBM and Cray computing that you were never going to beat and you were never going to get away from the mainframe. And then Microsoft was the giant evil, right? So it's not the case that, right? Like if history ends up being repeated, there will be like another cycle after this. It's more the question of recentering on what is the real objective and designing your actions to achieve concrete objectives and just work towards those rather than getting lost in a lot of the confusion. And that's where I think Brendan's sort of offering, like, is it really about core things like the Bill of Rights, right? Designing protocols and infrastructures that are protecting freedom of assembly and things like that, right? If we see that now we're hitting the point where even governments can't protect that, a government can't successfully embody those things on a massive scale or on a global scale, can we actually inoculate the web's infrastructure to provide some basic protections for those things to occur? And is that what we're working on, right? Is that the objective? And then in which case it's like, oh, well, yeah, Facebook might make tons of money and have lots of influence over people's behaviors, but what can we do to make sure that there's still some protections in there in the way the information flows? So I find that intriguing as a way to think about it. It lets you swipe away a lot of the other noise and think of it a little bit more tactically.
I thought I saw a hand maybe from Brendan, and I wonder, oh, from Don. Okay. And if anybody else wants to go too, note it somewhere.
Okay, I'll go next. Yeah, I guess I kind of had a response to what everyone has said before me. Sorry, I just dropped my pencil. But maybe to start just where Matt said, left off. I mean, my first thought is like caution against like linking so closely understanding of what we'll say we're designing for to like one specific nation state's articulation of a rights framework. And then I think there are these like kind of global agreements around sets of rights that maybe is where you land. But then I think what I think about what some of mesh networking stuff is connecting to is actually like a questioning of like thinking about forms of self-governance and sort of where, kind of like how allied you see kind of like maybe your values with things that are like then codified in rights framework. So not to say that I know, I just feel like that to me that there's something hovering around that well, I would definitely be nervous about it being stuck on one specific like country's articulation, especially in talking about a global context, but then also understanding like what self-determination really means even within those contexts. And then kind of to this more like tactical move of like understanding next steps. I think there was kind of an interesting parallel in Brendan, how you talked about kind of the incrementalism of like how the web got to where it is now. And I think like Cory Doctorow does a really good articulation of this in his own like pretty like fervent take on like how you prevent your future self from compromise, knowing that people compromise and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to figure out the stuff you can't compromise on and prevent yourself from being able to do it in the future. And he uses like the history of the internet and web as like a model to talk about that. And like I think infective licenses and DRM are like his big jams around that. And then on the other side is like a parallel would be this notion of like what does transition from now look like, which I think is a way that people, maybe not in the context of like decentralizing communications, but more in a like, I'm thinking more like autonomous Marxist sort of like hat wearing person, like where you would talk about transition to like get to, you know, new forms of ownership or something. And I don't know. I mean, like, I think that is like really helpful and like tactical, but I think there's like moments where you have to like not just do that. Like it's like this, like, so maybe what Rob said before or someone else, this notion of like you kind of, I think, have to figure out at different scales, like some things, or like know when you need to know how, like something in the future as opposed to like leaving it, because then you could risk repeating this sort of, hey, through incremental steps that felt right at the time, we like wound up somewhere which was not kind of, you know, truly emancipatory or where we wanted to head. So I don't know. I mean, I think these are all stuff that people are wrestling with. And I think it's cool to like recognize that maybe that wrestling is also happening in this space.
Yeah, I hope I'm not too laggy or anything. I don't feel like my thoughts are too articulate, but I was thinking about some of the stuff Don said and what Matt said before. But, you know, if your objective is to kind of embed a set of values into it's not totally obvious what the level of organization is at which to be, you know, active. I think like compare it to the radical movements at the beginning of the 20th century, you know, which wanted to mostly overthrow capitalism. They were pretty clear that the apparatus of the state was what they needed to seize control of in order to affect the changes that they wanted to affect. And, you know, they were both successful and radically unsuccessful, you know, so they seized the apparatus of the state and were terrible at implementing, you know, socialism, and what they did implement was a disaster, you know. So but at least they thought they knew where to point their efforts. I'm not sure, like we live in a moment where nation states are less powerful than they were, as Matt and I think Don and maybe some others noted. So where do you apply pressure? Like in standards bodies? Where does I guess one of the questions is like, where does power reside? Where are the levers that can be moved by, you know, clever, engaged people who want to make change?
I totally want to put Michelle Hertzfeld on the spot. Like,
do you? Yeah.
You work with 18F. You know how governments work.
This is true. I missed the first half of this conversation, though. Are you specifically talking about government stuff?
We just drifted into it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you need context? We don't.
There's a thing. It's called. It's called Where the Heck Are We? Yeah, great thoughts though. I support these messages and the brains behind them. But yes, same problem in government. What the heck? Mm-hmm. The look you're seeing on my face is so much. How to even start? Don, you were, I don't know, people are raising hands or whatever, but Don, yeah.
I was gonna just try and provide a sentence.
Masha just put something in the chat. Do you want to say something out loud? And then Don?
Oh, well, I was just gonna like respond to what you said about how like the, I guess the direction of where to put the power, you know, for like the economic influences versus governmental influences and things like that. But you know, it's not necessarily just the economic influences. Well, actually, to a certain extent, obviously, copyright has a lot to do with the economy, but that was like a governmental decision that severely impacts not just the ability to speak and to like express yourself and to connect with people, but also just access to information and things like that too. And it has a global impact as well. So it's not just in the specific jurisdiction towards which it was meant to legislate.
Don, did you want to go, or why don't you give the sentence of context?
Can you fix it? So I think my understanding of the second half of this question being like, where are we focusing our attention is like a point of intervention. The the first half of that sentence is like, if we sort of maybe don't have a shared agreement about values, so maybe building values is part of this, but like thinking about like truly maybe better for people, I would use the word emancipatory forms of like decentralization. So kind of going through a wake of like what decentralization maybe not actually doing what it's intended to do conversations prior. That feels not perfect. So someone else please correct.
Can I pile onto that? Yeah, I just think I don't know if you would acknowledge this distinction, Don, but like I think like, can we think about decentralization from like its social values specifically, like dropping the technology away for a second? Is that fair? We could layer it in, but I got a reaction out of Zoom wall.
You got a reaction about a lot of people.
Who wants to go? I missed it.
Can I just say my first, it's like a one sentence thing and I don't have a strong response. Brendan, I just think actually the term decentralization is really hooked into a technical conceptualization because of kind of how it became popularized and spread into cultural under the context. Like, I think there are other words that I would favor where I only talking about social form. I would say like self-governance, autonomy. Like I wouldn't call it decentralization, but that's all.
So it has to stay inside that frame. Yeah, and that was kind of the point of my question was like, can it leave that frame or does it need to be part of it? I'm totally all for that.
Well, there's also the very interesting thing that like when you read Elinor Ostrom's work, she uses the term decentralization. In a paper from like 1990, she's using the term decentralization as an economics term. And like, that's something that it wouldn't have jumped out at me 8 years ago, but then reading her stuff this year, it was like, oh wow, like there's this other well explored documented notion of decentralization that lots of people have done a lot of work on. But that's a bit of it's relevant, but it's like a side topic. The main thing I think for Megahertz would be, I think what we did in this conversation is we unpacked or we problematized the situation of even if we were to be successful at deploying all of these decentralized protocols and decentralized technologies, it is very possible that we would not have achieved any of the social or economic objectives. And so then it leaves this question of what's the point? Because if the point is to do more than just achieve this change in technology patterns, then how do we express that? And then how do we express how is that aligned with pushing for decentralized approaches technologically? And we're just sort of mucking around in that space. Rob had his hand up.
I don't know that I have anything to add because my thought lost some cohesion in what you just said.
Okay, yes, that's beautiful. Beautiful context. And something that keeps me up at night.
And I do, unless someone else had their hand up, it's definitely sort of at my position at Protocol Labs where we stand at this locus of the only commonality of the people who are connected with us is that they're excited about some aspect of decentralization, but there are the people who are just in it for the money. There are the people they're all about the blockchain and they're all about decentralizing business. They don't really care about the like social values around decentralization. And then there's tons and tons of permutations of why someone sees personal like social value in decentralizing. And those people are all talking past each other, especially when it comes to essential values. They're all just like rushing forward without much crosstalk about core values and objectives there, which, I mean, the past indicates probably, if you continue to operate in that way without a clear articulation of different perspectives, you just get whoever's the most powerful or the richest having things configured in a way that's most convenient for them.
Jeremy, go ahead.
Something that I thought might be a helpful use case distinction or contextual distinction would be a lot of people are talking about decentralization. They are talking about economic disintermediation, or they are talking about the disintermediation of some sort of governmental power in terms of the execution of a governmental power in how it is enacted. And many of the people who are, we call them, I guess, wonks. So mostly this crowd, some of this crowd, data wonks and policy wonks, and people who wear slacks for a living. I think it's very easy if you work at if you work in the civic sphere and you have basically in the classic liberal sense, a mandate to be a watcher of something, to be a person whose job it is to ensure that every scrap of something that might be suppressed by an administration is not suppressed, or everything that might be disrupted, that might be government influence on social media is prevented from being influenced. It's very neat. It's neatly packaged for you. You can have this self-image and this community identity as guardians, but that's not really true once you extend that to the proliferation of a multitude of value systems that can't possibly be aligned, because you have to either stake your involvement on the notion that you're providing tools, you're providing means that are in some sense universally available, in the sense that they allow any given person with any given interest in using the tools to operate them to whatever effect whatever consequence may come of that, or you're picking and choosing, and you probably can't really get away with something in the middle, not coherently, not over the long run at scale. True or false?
Go, Michelle, or Megan.
It's funny, I always use that as a handle, but not everyone has always used it speaking, so I still mess that one up too, so thanks, yeah. It is a difficult thing. The thing that I've been thinking about lately with this conflict between, of course, you can't decide on one value system or one way that will always be the thing. It's what are the things that are always true? It's change, supporting people have conversations about change. Maybe it's something in that space, maybe, and how it's well, we get to the more of the commons discussion later, I think in a couple of weeks, but Matt was saying about Elinor Ostrom's work around how you build systems so that those conversations can happen regardless of what that value system is really interesting to me. And how then the peer-to-peer part, like you said, some of the discussions end up being really we're doing this for the money, or we're doing this for not for these, you could very much unintentionally build a system that makes it so nobody talks to each other ever and just goes off, like you said, into these little corners of talking to 150 people. And that's not the thing, that doesn't help us get to the thing. So in any case, looping back, what am I trying to say? Change, figuring out how to deal with change, trusting each other, having conversations. Maybe there's a space in there where we can sidestep the deciding what that conversation is, but making sure the conversation happens well.
I feel there are two sets of very difficult not just conversations, but types of effort. There's how do you build a technical system that is pleasant to use and works most of the time? That's hard. How do you build a society that you want to live in? That hasn't been done yet. And how do you build the one to make the other? It's extremely difficult, right? On the one hand, I don't know, I feel different ways about it, but one way I feel is kind of around the way that Matt described it. Like maybe sometimes you got to look up from your, your like global things, or look down from your global objectives and think, what are the concrete things I want to build?
Go, Brendan.
Given that I just found out there's no such thing as a society that I could ever want to live in, I'm now very sad.
It just hasn't done yet.
I think it's worth sort of pointing out, like recently I was listening to some liberal wonk podcast, and they were talking about like how like the faith in the current like tech, like the techlash that is happening right now, and like how like faith in tech as these like harbingers of like the techno-utopian dream has just like crumbled inside of like 4 months. And it's just like, oh cool. Like, and my favorite, my partner's an architect. One of my favorite like things to do is compare like the golden age of architects when they were they had the baton for like, oh, we're going to bring forth utopia with our architecture. We're going to build buildings, and you're all there will be a space for play. There will be a space for shop. There'll be a space for exist, and it'll all be just so resolved. And it didn't work, and it crumbled. It took a lot longer to crumble if the techlash sort of holds. But I think we have like this similar situation right now, particularly with technical people. Like I think we have sort of fallen into this role in society where we are people do look to because we have made very grandiose promises and say, hey, we can terraform our value system. Like we're having this exact conversation right now, and some of that's like I'm sort of waiting for the moment when we sort of fall back a little bit from that and are sort of recontextualized in terms of our profession, in terms of the other wonderful professions in the world. I don't know. That's sometimes a contested viewpoint. But the point being, like, we sort of assume that there's an intersection between these tech stacks and our social value systems, and that one can predicate the other. And like maybe that's a less productive angle than simply sort of precluding the things we know really shouldn't, and instead like thinking about designing our tech systems in the negative, almost saying like one thing that I feel a little bit strongly about is that like I don't like that like my ISP, my browser, my operating system, and my social networks all get a chance to spy on me in succession. And I would like it if a tech stack existed that allowed me some sort of active opt-out, even if it was difficult. And ideally it would be less difficult. But yeah, like I'm wondering if maybe the positioning of this conversation is part of the question. Like maybe we've sort of naturally fallen into the step of like, oh, we can design this technology and it will bring forth virtuous societies. Maybe we should just be trying to prevent shitty societies from coming into existence.
Yeah, I saw Don and then I guess Matt's.
Okay, so I had something to say to the middle of what you said, but it's not quite the end, because I mean, I think you can define, or you could sort of decide to like work from negatives to like avoid outcomes. But my sense is you need some positive of like, this is the thing we want. But I actually was thinking about sort of like a little bit before when you're talking about kind of like, how do we see a thing we don't want? And I feel like Michelle Murphy has been talking about this, and it's kind of come up in some other edgy conversations, particularly the environmental data justice group, is sort of like really drawing on notions of like refusal of like, how do you find these like really damaging practices to make like stop? And then how do you make like one step otherwise? So I feel like I'm stuck on this very like I like cautioned against, but I have this like very tactical like mind space right now where I'm like, okay, like what are the like first couple steps? Like what would be like, and then, okay, if we say that this is how we're like consciously adopting this as a tactic, and that's even how, like what's motivating how something is designed, then it would be like, okay, how do we implement this? Like, where's the site? I'm not sure if that offers something long lasting, but maybe it's like from where we're at now, like maybe that's the right place to start. I'm not sure.
Could you describe that again? The stuff that Michelle Murphy's been working on.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, like I think it's drawing on sort of like a bunch of like literature and engagements or like interventions, but the framing is like sort of like refusing like damaging or harmful practices and thinking there's this great, I can post a link for follow-up, but there's this article or letter by Eve Tuck about like preventing damage-based research. So it's like thinking about like who bears the brunt of being researched, even when trying to like ameliorate like, you know, inequality, which sometimes is why, like, say some communities get more research than others, but it can be an extremely damaging process, especially in its like, you know, settler, colonial, imperial, late stage capitalist legacies. And so this notion of like refusing is like just saying no to a current practice, but then sort of also being like, okay, here's what we replace that with. Here's the thing that's not doing the same form of harm.
Thanks for that. I want to learn more about it, but that would derail this whole conversation. So I'll go back to what I was going to say. This whole conversation has me thinking about so I had this learning process when I started leaving the US more, where I was like constantly trying to like strip back on the American nationalist pride that I had been trained into by the government that raised me, and actually hit a point where a lot of people from other countries ended up sort of sitting me down and being like, no, there is something really inspiring about the ideal of what the USA was and how it was formed. There's something inspiring about this idea of of like having a Bill of Rights, the ideas of like liberty and democracy, and like the advent of a modern democracy. That many people have been inspired by those ideas, and those ideas reverberate around the world. And there's that sense in which this country doesn't really live up to those, or rarely lives up to those ideals, but it has still functioned as an icon of those ideals for a lot of people. And so all of that to say, there's that sense in which ideas are things that can be contagious and can spread independently of a nation state. And it leaves me wondering, like, are we partially engaged in an exercise to figure out what are the kernels of a positive, inspiring social configuration that you can put into some form that it can exist independently of a nation state and be propagated? Like, is that what we're engaged in? Yeah, and that's where I just want to dive right in and like problematize that, of like teasing all of that open, and what are all the different ways to look at like what exactly are the ideas to perpetuate and propagate. But yeah, that's a whole other, maybe we can tack that onto the end of the reading list. It can have its own reading groups. Now I want to read everyone's comments.
No problem. I'm reading them too.
What I forgot to say was like contrasting it with the inspiring, but like when you look back at the idealism of the pioneers of the early World Wide Web, a lot of it is inspiring, but it feels kind of quaint, right? It feels a little bit simplistic, and it like hasn't borne the test of time of it in terms of robustness of like once it's tested in the world. And so there's a reckoning at that level that I don't see people doing on a broad scale. I see it like coming up in small ways of people being like much more critical of like technocracy and being like critical of like aspects of it, but like a cohesive re-envisioning, I don't see that happening right now. And maybe that's what we need.
Should we make that the end? Or does someone have something they want to say?
You're all really cool.
It seems to me that we kind of, a thing we got here was, a provisional answer to what are we trying to do in this reading group, which is what's the point? What is it that to what extent, in what ways does distributed move us towards a set of shared values? And do we even know what those shared values are? And so I like that. That sounds pretty good. I don't think we answered the question, but we posed it, right? Maybe we can kind of try to, if we want to bring something, to the next, the subsequent sessions, it's those questions maybe. So yeah, how do people feel? It's basically end of our time. You want to go, Dawn?
I just want to sort of say a logistic thing. So we have sort of hashed out a set of readings for upcoming sessions, but they get a little bit sketchy later, and they're not perfect. Like if other people have ones that they feel are super great, and I think Matt Zed already suggested one, please do that in whatever means feels best. Like you could do it by email or a GitHub issue, you could open a pull request to change it. I sort of looked around at examples for how people have organized reading groups, and just because Data Together does everything in GitHub, we use that. But it's a little scrappy and it'll maybe get a bit cleaned up over time. I think also we could collect more readings to put under, but then choose a subset to focus on, like if there's just too much good stuff. And Matt P facilitated, but our hope was also that if people were interested, they might also want to facilitate a future session. So maybe just to like get people thinking on that, but we have a little bit of time before the next one. So not to say we have to pick that today.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, this I as this got into this kind of like what's the point space, I felt reassured by knowing that the next time this convenes, there's this concrete thing of talking about ownership, right? So it's fine for this session to have teased it apart in this kind of like, whoa, what are we doing here? Because we can come up with topics that frame it in like very different ways and let us get specific, but still having this in mind. And I agree, Don, like the first couple are really solid, and then it gets a little bit like, how's that gonna work as a conversation? And then there's a whole bunch more that I would want to propose that we could discuss, and maybe just do that in pull requests, so we don't need to use synchronous time to iterate on what would be great to be discussing in September. Oh yeah, are we also on those pull requests saying, oh, I'd like to moderate this one? Or how are we doing that specific thing of making sure there's a convener for each one?
We could easily do that by pull request, because we just have a note pad. Like we just have the README, which is where all the notes are. But I think I'll say we could do that way, or the other way that Data Together stuff works is, we would almost set that up in an issue so someone could claim it, and that's how we've operated running roundtables in the main Data Together repo. So that might be a little more in the style of how Data Together stuff has been happening. I see a lot of nods, so why don't we do that? So I can kind of like set that up as issues, and then anyone can chime in if they're interested in leading one of the future conversations. And just to say this, sorry to just keep talking, Mash and Jeremy. So I feel like you probably saw the link to the GitHub, but is that an okay format, or is there a better, like, I want to make sure that I feel like we do everything on GitHub, but that's like sort of, we've worked ourselves into this like idiom that might not be so straightforward.
That's fine for us. The bigger thing is I didn't actually know that this was happening until today, like early middle of the night. So the it's Slack. It's finding out anything through Slack Slack is just the worst. It's the worst. And if you wear Slacks, then you love Slack. But if you don't wear Slacks, then that's the rule. That's everyone. They force you to use Slack. And I'm not very good at being forced to use communication tools. I'll put it that way. So, what is the most up-to-date version of where is the official calendar now?
We have there's a Google Calendar, and it's like linked from, and there's sort of details on that in the Data Together repo.
Okay. All right, I'll check it out.
Yeah, and so that is maintained and it's up to date, and it has a
cool.
link and everything.
Cool. Yeah. Great.
Okay. All right, guys. So that was great. And let's just continue with our lives as we normally do and see each other episodically until our next meeting in July. Yeah?
Thanks, Matt, for moderating, as Don said.
Thank you all for coming. I didn't really do much moderating. Thanks for stepping up when I was in and out.
300%, 87 threads. It's dope.
Wait. Before you close it, does yours setup automatically save the chat? Because there were good comments in the chat that were not spoken in the recording.
It does. It saves to the cloud, and it automatically will go to YouTube on an unlisted link. Thank you, Pekan. But we also have a transcript of the chat, and I think that the only place that lives is like if someone logs into Zoom, but I can download a copy as well.
Okay.
Mind if I just paste is anyone offended if I just paste the chat into the notes?
Yeah, go for it.
If anyone doesn't want to be in there, feel free to edit the notes. You knock yourself out. I don't think it's a bad thing, but yeah.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.